Hello and welcome to the first episode of Gaps in the Gospel. If you don't know what this series is about, check out the other video which tells you all those kind of things, because you need to settle in and get ready for our first piece of scripture, which is John chapter 8 verses 1 to 11. John chapter 8 verses 1 to 11 is sometimes called the woman caught in adultery, and it's a really famous story. In fact, it's one of my favourites. In the story, Jesus is confronted by a huge mob of people, all trying to trick him into making a controversial decision. Jesus often faced this kind of stuff in the Gospels. But always have a listen to what happens, and then we'll go into the gaps and try and figure out what we can interpret and what we can imagine maybe happened in the bits that aren't found in the written text, to try and better understand what Jesus was doing and what this Gospel can really say to us in our lives. So, let's start. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Then everyone went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the next morning he went back to the temple. All the people gathered around him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman who had been caught committing adultery, and they made her stand before them all. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. In our law, Moses commanded that such a woman should be stoned to death. Now, what do you say?" They said this to trap Jesus, so that they could accuse him. But he bent over and wrote in the ground with his finger. As they stood there asking him questions, he straightened up and said to them, "Whichever one of you has committed no sin may throw the first stone against her." Then he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard this, they all left one by one, the older ones first. Jesus was left alone with the woman standing there. He straightened up and said to her, "Where are they? Is there no one left to condemn you?" "No one, sir," she answered. "Well then," Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go, but do not sin again." The Gospel of the Lord. This is one of my all-time favourite stories. It's incredible, and I love the way that Jesus is both bold and courageous and fearless, but also compassionate and merciful and loving. There's a few really interesting facts that we can drill down to, but the real gap that I want us to talk about today is what Jesus wrote in the ground. You've got a massive crowd all kicking off, there's lots of tension and anger and frustration, and he just stops and starts drawing in the ground. But what did he draw? There's no reference to it in scripture. But there is some insight and inspiration we can take from looking elsewhere in the Bible, and also from kind of modern understanding, which I'll go through with you now, and then maybe we can have a think about what we thought Jesus wrote in that little gap in the Gospel. So, first things first, bit of background. It was a festival feast day in the story, and that means that Jesus wouldn't have been able to do any work. On the Sabbath, you weren't allowed to work, and work meant anything apart from resting pretty much. In fact, in the Jewish law, even writing 2 letters would have been considered work. Interestingly though, one of the nuances of Jewish law was that if you wrote in the dust, it wasn't considered work. So maybe what Jesus was saying before they even started was that, actually, don't mess with me, because I know the law, I know the scriptures, okay? And maybe that's what he was saying. But what he went on to write, some people have suggested it might have been a passage from Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, it talks about the fact that anyone who turns away from the Lord, that their name will be written in the dust. Maybe he was saying that those people who were trying to condemn this woman and be horrible to her were in fact turning away from God, and actually he was writing their names to kind of make them aware of their actions, or make them just stop and look at themselves and what they were doing. Maybe he just wrote the scripture reference. Maybe he just wrote down that passage so that they started to self-examine. We don't know. But interestingly, of course, this chapter before, Jesus refers to himself as the kind of water of life. And if you've got the water of life, and those who turn away from God are written in the dust, you've got kind of like the water and the dryness. Maybe Jesus, and the reason it's in that part of the Gospel, is about saying that actually, stay with me, drink the water of life, or have your names written in the dust, where there is no life, because you're turning away from God. I mean, maybe Jesus was just trying to stall, maybe take the pressure out of the situation, or stall the crowd in their tracks. We don't know. But I want you to think about what you think Jesus would have written. What would you have written to try and stop an angry mob from doing something horrible? Interestingly, of course, he goes back to writing in the sand. So maybe he hadn't finished what he was doing, or maybe he wants to write something else. We don't know. It's a gap in the Gospel. But it's a great revelation of Jesus' love and mercy, and also his courage and intellect and awesomeness. At the end of the story, Jesus forgives the woman's sins. And that's another thing, that if you look throughout Scripture, you find people saying that actually only God can forgive sins. And when Jesus is doing that, he's saying, yeah, figure it out, people. So when the woman went away, what did she see in the sand? Who knows? It's a gap in the gospel. But he gets us thinking about how Jesus can be all of those amazing things wrapped up into one, and how we can learn more about his awesomeness by looking at the stories of his life in the Gospels. Please write in the comments box below what you think Jesus drew in the sand. It's one of my favourite kind of mysteries, and we'll look forward to hearing your ideas. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you can find out the next in these series. And don't forget, particularly in this year of the Word, to read the story of Jesus, the Word made flesh, and find out as much as we can about this amazing, amazing person who reveals what God is all about through everything he said and did. We'll see you soon.